Whether you like it or not, Monster Hunter World is arguably one of, if not the, most influential factor as to why the series stands where it does today. Not only did it innovate with numerous quality of life upgrades, much more fluid movement, and expand on the already diverse combat system, it brought in an audience bigger than the series had ever seen before, and according to the June 2021 statistics, it is still Capcom's highest selling game, sitting at 17.3 million units, selling millions and millions of more copies than its second biggest competitor, Resident Evil 7, which is at 9.8 million units sold. And even World's Iceborne expansion is closely behind with its sales, which is unheard of for Monster Hunter and even Capcom when looking at the all-time sales figures. But as with every journey, we have to go to the very beginning to truly understand this arduous success story. The first Monster Hunter game was one of 3 titles Capcom had developed to take advantage of the PlayStation 2's new processing power and online capabilities. The other 2 titles being Auto Modelista and Resident Evil Outbreak. The intention of the game was for players to join together of varying skill levels and fight together to take down large monsters, which of course is a big key core concept of Monster Hunter still to this very day. The original Monster Hunter proved to be a massive success, selling over 1 million copies primarily in Japan, but that was enough for Capcom to realise what they'd created. Following on from the base game release, they released multiple enhanced versions over time, adding additional content such as more monsters and more maps for the player to explore. In Japan, these versions generally added the G suffix to the end, like Monster Hunter G or Monster Hunter 2G, whereas in the West, these were replaced with the Freedom title, and then later, the Ultimate. When Monster Hunter first became portable for Sony's handheld PSP, portable was the suffix for the Japan releases, whereas the Western releases took the title Freedom. Although these differentiations in titles were soon abandoned, the core concept of having 2 teams to handle the home console and portable games separately has been maintained to this day, with our most recent home console game being Monster Hunter World, and our most recent portable game being Monster Hunter Rise. After Monster Hunter 2, also known as Monster Hunter DOS, Monster Hunter primarily was a portable title, at least for the mainline series, where it was on the PSP, then the Wii, and then the 3DS and Wii U, with the PSP and 3DS releases receiving the most focus. A lot of this was due to the fact that Monster Hunter's majority market audience was in Japan, where portable consoles are huge due to the hectic on-the-go lifestyle the country has, with most of the releases being seen on the 3DS. The series took off explosively with the PSP releases in Japan, and even more once the consequent sequels released. During the release of Monster Hunter Portable 3rd on the PSP, which was never officially ported to the Western regions, it was the best-selling PSP title in Japan. While this major success was found in the East, it was not reciprocated in the Western world. The markets from the West were less keen for portable systems, and generally home consoles and PCs were the go-to, and because of a thinner population density, most players were reliant on internet-based gaming, which was pushed heavily rather than the local ad hoc networking the Monster Hunter games were using at the time. This was definitely a prominent issue for those in love with the game, but lacking others who enjoyed this at the time niche game series. In addition to this, the series had quite a difficult learning curve, which for sure played a big factor in why many were put off in the Western markets. This Western popularity had started to change though, with the release of Monster Hunter 3 Ultimate on the Nintendo 3DS, and years prior with Monster Hunter Tri on the Wii. The console had truly planted its flag into the Western land and made a name for itself, and while the series' audience was still quite small in the West in comparison to the Japan massive following, Capcom saw the potential the series had if they looked to fix some of the areas that made the game less appealing, and made sure to make the following entries in the series more attractive and enticing to the Western audience, while maintaining what was so widely loved over in the east. Monster Hunter's fourth mainline entry would go on to break into the Western market and reach 1 million sales, and this only fueled Capcom to try even harder to push one of their biggest franchises further into the Western market, where in 2016, Capcom chairman Kenzo Sugimoto said they were looking towards increasing the popularity of the Monster Hunter franchise in the West, recognizing that this meant they would need to move on from the handheld systems for the time being and move on to the Western powerhouses that dominated the console scene, PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, foreshadowing what the series had in store for the near future. With Monster Hunter 4 being widely loved by fans in Japan, and then later coming to the West only to obtain even more success, Capcom had started development on the fifth mainline entry to the series, 3 years before the E3 reveal. Given their motivation to dig their soon-to-be clutch claws deep into the markets of the East and West, Capcom re-evaluated where they wanted to take the series and realised that with the hardware capabilities of the new consoles, they could go in a different direction and vision compared to what the handheld series had done for many years. This was quite a scary jump for the company, as the Japanese teams had been wary of pushing this more Western release that focused more on multiplayer and full online gaming support, as their handheld formula generally assured them at least 3 to 4 million sales within Japan, and they would risk that actuality with a global push. But with Sony's backing to push the game worldwide, correctly predicting it would help boost the PS4 sales, Capcom embraced this new venture. With a fresh take on the series to be made, the developers looked to break some of the arcane rules that the prior games had set, with one of the key changes being the zoned area structure. In previous games, areas were locked to their specific zones and joined by loading screens. This made up the entire map. This made each zone feel isolated, and this was going to change. In addition to this, World was developed with the aim to make the world more alive and implement ecosystems with complex artificial intelligence interactions between monsters and the environment, which was not possible on the hardware that came before on the handheld entries. The team pushed for a more realistic and highly detailed world, eliminating the disconnected zone map approach, completely making every map in the game extremely large, fleshed out, and with zones that felt fully connected. This would ripple effect into other areas, such as gameplay, where strategies such as going into an empty area to heal, then returning to the zone where the monster is, would be removed, which then led to consumables being able to be used while walking to make up for it. This was the start of the faster pace the series would take on as time progressed, and it would only evolve from here. A prototype was also created during this time by a team of 50 to 70 developers to test the seamless transition in the map and how monsters would interact with this new environment concept. Environments were focused so heavily that a combat system was not even put in place, so the monsters had to be evaded or dispatched through other means, which helped the team to recognise that player survival could be achieved by the use of the environment alone, which became a key part of World's identity. While World has an extensive list of monsters from previous entries of the franchise, the developers, as expected, began to craft new monsters that took advantage of the more powerful processing power, making them feel more alive than ever before. A design of a monster generally began around the conceptualization of a mechanic or feature for the monster that the player would have to work around and possibly exploit to defeat it, and then working with the level designers, they made the monster feel like it belongs where it is encountered. This in turn helped with the realism and immersion that the developers strived to achieve. Monsters were also able to have more individual features that could now be more effectively animated compared to prior games, such as feathers on bird-like monsters, or monsters taking on different forms, one of my favourite examples being the epic transformation that Shara Ishvalda takes on during that quest, after it has sustained enough damage. A better example of this being the amount of detail that they could show on monsters like Nergigante, where as it becomes more aggressive and enraged, its spikes become darker in colour and larger in size until fully black and harder than steel. This visual change allows the player to adapt and they prepare for how they are going to tackle the monster at that given time, allowing for multiple stages of a monster rather than the normal two states of enraged and not enraged. In addition to this, monster animation was also further developed by having motion capture implemented into their movements, partly with human actors acting out some of the various monster movements. After the monster had been created, that's when they could finally begin to develop the weapons and armour to keep the consistency throughout the game's visuals. As development went on, more and more features were added to fit Western standards, notably in areas such as controls, interface design, and general user accessibility. They looked to provide more information for the tutorials, as well as making these fully voiced, which was something they'd started a bit of in Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate, which was much more user-friendly in terms of its tutorials, where prior games were very minimal with the tutorials, losing a lot of players in early game, something both the console and portable teams were now well aware of. The developers realised that this would very likely be the first game many Westerners would play, so they made sure development of the game would adhere to veterans of the series, as well as those first-time players that had no knowledge from previous entries in the series. This in turn meant easing the learning curve and providing information to the starting player, which some fans would go on to disapprove of, but nevertheless was a step in the right direction, as it was no coincidence that this game pushed the franchise above the clouds. Konami Fujioka responded to some of the initial criticism of how the westernization of the game was making it easier for the sake of making more money, but that was not the intention at all. The goal here was to make the game more fair when you were hit, and encourage the player to be able to observe the monster's behaviours and attacks to allow them to learn to take advantage of that and manipulate it to assist them in the hunt. He went on to say how they want it to be if the player was to make a mistake, they don't feel it's unfair and instead think that it's their mistake and they have to grow and learn from it. The changes made were for easing the learning curve, but not the core difficulty. This was quite evident at the end of the life cycle, where all difficulties were present in Monster Hunter World, and you could tell the sharp difference between the game's easiest content and the hardest content. But even during its life cycle, they were able to implement mechanics and features for monsters to make sure the veterans of the series were still getting their money's worth. The title suffix of World to the 5th installment of the series had many intentions for the game's design, one of which being the idea of how maps were now wide open rather than different areas of one map tied together via loading screens. Another being the large emphasis on the world around the hunter and monsters and how the monsters live and behave in it. A key story thread being the idea of how monsters are affecting the ecosystem and what role hunters and the guild as a whole play in it. Capcom also opted to use a non-numerical value for the entry to help keep new players from feeling that they need to play the previous entries in the series before World to enjoy the game to the fullest. The game utilised a modded version of Capcom's internally developed MT framework engine, which provided a minimum of 30 frames per second on all platforms, with the consoles doing a good job at handling the Monster Hunter entry. Many are unaware of the fact that the development of Monster Hunter World was actually initiated before the reveal of the next-gen consoles, but luckily they were able to get help, partially from Sony and Microsoft, to make sure World ran efficiently on those, at the time, newer consoles. In addition to the console releases, shortly after, a PC version was released, and this was extremely impactful to the Monster Hunter series, bringing in a lot of new players. However, this version was delayed, releasing a year later after the console release, in order to make sure it was optimised and fine-tuned as much as possible, with all work being done within Capcom internally to avoid treating the game as an outsourced port. They strategically tackled this situation by pushing the console release first and then focusing on the PC release, as they required a lot of different areas that needed attending to. World would stay an exclusive to these platforms, making it the first mainline entry in over a decade to not be on a handheld. But we would then see the release of Monster Hunter Rise for the series' handheld return. January 26th, 2018. The day Monster Hunter World released after around 2/3 of a year since its E3 2017 reveal. Prior to this, Capcom had PlayStation exclusive timed betas in the weekends leading up to the game's launch. World was generally met with a lot of positive feedback for the most part, notably being praised largely for how it was welcoming new players and how it pushed the series to evolve. The initial release would be followed by a bunch of cross-promotional content, ranging from games such as Street Fighter, Devil May Cry, The Witcher, and much more. PlayStation players were also treated to an exclusive crossover event, with its first-party title, Horizon Zero Dawn. And then in August of 2018, we would see one of the first big crossover events with Final Fantasy, where players of Final Fantasy XIV were able to face off against Rathalos, and World's players were able to face off against the Final Fantasy monster, Behemoth. This collaboration event goes as far back as 2011 in terms of how long it had been discussed, where Ryozo Sugimoto had reached out to Yoshida, the director of Final Fantasy XIV, but originally the offer was declined. But later, during the start of World's development, Yoshida agreed to the cross-promotion event, and the two began working out the details and implementation. Soon after, we would get a Witcher, Resident Evil, and Assassin's Creed crossover, only elevating the fanbase and increasing the game's grip on the Western market. In addition to all these collaborations, older monsters would also gradually be brought back over time via little updates, including monsters such as Deviljho and Lunastra. At the end of 2018, Capcom announced a major expansion to Monster Hunter World, calling it Iceborne, which would release in September of the following year to come, with a PC release following the console release a few months after. As with the prior Ultimate expansions of the past, Iceborne aimed to add new areas, monsters, quests, and story, following on from the events of the base game. Iceborne would also have a timed beta exclusive to PlayStation 4 users, similar to the base game, which was a hit with many fans, finally bringing about that higher difficulty many had been craving. G rank was added, but with a new name, Master Rank, and this was due to the lack of awareness with the G rank term in the Western releases. Just like G rank, this would up the difficulties significantly, but provide the player with much stronger armor and weapons. The team intentionally upped the learning curve, as many had wanted, as the base game had been set up perfectly just as they'd wanted, as preparation for new players to be eased into this beautiful and diverse world, and then to be thrown into the deep end later in their journey. Iceborne brought in a new tundra area, requiring players to deal with the effects of the cold, and slowing down where snow was piled thick. Additional equipment and tools were also brought in to support the player for this new venture. As the developers wanted players to have the option to more easily access Iceborne if purchased, they provided players with an advanced armor set that would help speed them through the world's base game, but only barely be sufficient for the start of their Iceborne adventure. In addition to all this, they implemented one of the biggest gameplay features to Monster Hunter World, that being the Clutch Claw. This would revamp the game's weakness exploit system and how damage was dealt to monsters, making the gameplay a bit more complex, although many could see this as a downside, as you would be putting yourself at a disadvantage not making good use of it. One of the best multiplayer changes was the addition of dynamic difficulty, which meant instead of hunts being scaled to either 1 or 4 players, it was now changed dependent on if you were solo, duo, or a full 4-man, with 3 players being scaled to 4-player difficulty. This would decrease if players were to depart the quest as well, making it much better for players who play with others who are likely to quit or have internet issues, increasing the chance of disconnection. The free updates would continue after Iceborne, most notably being the updates that brought about Elatrion and Fatalis. both of which were met with much praise with their difficulty and how much they brought to the table as a free update. Iceborne would go on to sell over 7 million copies on top of the base game's 17 million, which collectively made it Capcom's most selling title by millions above the contenders. With Monster Hunter Rise in its initial stages of its life cycle, we can only imagine what the future has for the game, but we do know it's made quite the impact on one platform alone, making 7.3 million sales on just the Nintendo Switch, so maybe the PC release is able to push that figure to Capcom's second largest entry of the company's long history. But with that said, that was the story of the Monster Hunter game that shot the series into the stratosphere. As always guys, if you did enjoy the video, if you could smash that like button and consider hitting the subscribe button as well while you're at it, it would be extremely appreciated and helps out the channel a ton. I did spend a long time making this video, so I would be very, very grateful. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye.